Hello friends, welcome to Premier UPSC IAS. So let's continue with the part 5 of the environment series for Prelims UPSC IAS examination. Okay. Before going into it, do subscribe to my channel and share for more videos. International conventions and protocols for climate change. Do you know that this topic is very important? Compulsory 3 to 4 questions are asked from the international conventions and protocols for climate change from the environment topic, either from the static part or from current part. Okay. Developments before the Earth Summit. So, background. The relationship between the economic development and environmental degradation was first placed on the international agenda in 1972 at the UN Conference on the Human Environment held in Stockholm, also called as Stockholm Conference. After the conference, the government set up the United Nations Environment Program. So UNEP actually came into existence after the UN Conference on the Human Environment in 1972, that is Stockholm Conference, which today continues to act as a global catalyst for action to protect the environment. In 1983, the UN set up the World Commission on Environment and Development. WCED, as environmental degradation was understood to be a matter of survival for developing nations. Led by Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Commission put forward the concept of sustainable development as an alternative approach. After considering the 1987 Brundtland report, the UN General Assembly called for the UN Conference for Environment and Development (UNCED). The primary goals of the summit were to come to an understanding of development that would support socio-economic development and prevent the continued deterioration of the environment, and to lay a foundation for a global partnership between the developing and more industrialized countries based on mutual needs and common interests that would ensure a healthy future for the planet. UN Conference on Human Environment 1972. The United Nations Conference on the Human Environment was an international conference convened under United Nations auspices held in Stockholm, Sweden from June 5 to 16, 1972. It is also known as Stockholm Conference. It was the UN's first major conference on international environmental issues. It marked a turning point in the development of international environmental politics. UN Environment Program UNEP 1972. The UN Environment Program UNEP is the leading global environmental authority. The UNEP has been authorized for the following: to set the global environmental agenda, to promote the coherent implementation of the environmental dimension of sustainable development within the United Nations system, and to serve as an authoritative advocate for the global environment. In India, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change (MOFSI) is the nodal ministry to assess the UNEP. UNEP's work encompasses the following: assessing global, regional, and national environmental conditions and trends, developing international and national environmental instruments, and strengthening institutions for the wise management of the environment. Every year, UNEP honor and celebrate individuals and institutions that are doing outstanding work on behalf of the environment. Focus areas of UNEP are: UNEP's focus areas are categorized into the following seven broad thematic areas. One, climate change; two, disasters and conflicts; three, ecosystem management; four, environmental governance; five, chemicals and waste; six, resource efficiency; seven, environment under review. UNEP as the host. UNEP also hosts several environmental conventions, secretariats, and interagency coordinating bodies. These include the following: the Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD), the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora (CITES), the Minamata Convention on Mercury, the Basel Convention. All these four are hosted by UNEP. Fifth, the Rotterdam Convention, the Stockholm Convention, the Vienna Convention for the Protection of Ozone Layer, the Montreal Protocol, the Convention on Migratory Species, the Carpathian Convention, the Bamako Convention, the Tehran Convention, etc. Flagship publications of UNEP are Our Planet, Tunza, A Way of Life, UNEP Magazine for Youth, Atlas, GEO, that is Global Environment Outlook. All these publications are released by UNEP. Direct questions can come: this report or this publication released by which institute? Therefore, UNEP publications should be remembered thoroughly. Brundtland Report 1987, Our Common Future. This report defined sustainable development as the following: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The report highlighted three fundamental components of sustainable development, such as environmental protection, economic growth, and social equity. Consequences of the report. Therefore, the concept of sustainable development focused attention on finding strategies to promote economic and social advancement. And this needs to be done in ways that avoid the following: environmental degradation, over exploitation, or pollution. Moreover, it sidelined less productive debates about whether to prioritize development or the environment. UN Conference on Environment and Development UNCED, also called as the Earth Summit of 1992. Rio Earth Summit 1992. 5 years after the Brundtland Report, the UN General Assembly asked for a report on progress made towards sustainable development and held the Rio Earth Summit. It took place in June 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and was regarded as the largest environmental conference ever held. Environment and sustainable development was the principal theme of the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. The developed nations demanded environmental sustainability, while the developing nations argued that they should be given the opportunity to catch up socioeconomic equality with the developed world. The objectives of the conference were the following: to build upon the hopes and achievements of the Brundtland Report in order to respond to pressing global environmental problems, to agree with the major treaties on biodiversity, climate change, and forest management. The biggest challenges faced at the Rio Earth Summit involved finance, population growth, and consumption rates. Five agreements or outcomes of the Rio de Janeiro or Rio Earth Summit were: Agenda 21, a comprehensive program for action for global action in all areas of sustainable development is called as Agenda 21. Sometimes these terms could be asked as a direct question as definition. The Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, a series of principles defining the rights and responsibilities of states. The Statement of Forest Principles, a set of principles to underlie the sustainable management of forests worldwide. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) was also an outcome of this Rio Earth Summit of 1992. The Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD). Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is an action plan initiated by United Nations related to sustainable development. Hence, Agenda 21 is a comprehensive blueprint of actions that are to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the UN governments and major groups in every area in which humans directly affect the environment. The number 21 refers to an agenda for the 21st century. Agenda 21 addresses the today's pressing problems and aims to prepare the world for the challenges of the next century. It contains detailed proposals for action in social and economic areas. The program of action also recommends ways to strengthen the part played by major groups in achieving the sustainable development. Agenda 24 for culture. It was agreed during the first World Public Meeting on Culture held in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 2002. This is the first document with a worldwide mission which advocates establishing the groundwork of an undertaking by cities and local governments for the development of culture. The Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. It supports Agenda 21 by defining the rights and responsibilities of states regarding these issues. Among its principles, that human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development, that scientific uncertainty should not delay measures to prevent environmental degradation, that states have a sovereign right to exploit their own resources but not to cause damage to the environment of other states, that eradicating poverty and reducing disparities in worldwide standards of living are indispensable for sustainable development, that full participation of women is essential, that developed countries acknowledge the responsibility that they bear in the international pursuit of sustainable development in view of the pressures their societies place on the global environment and of the technologies and financial resources they command. The Statement of Forest Principles. The Statement of Forest Principles was the first global consensus reached on forests. It is a non-legally binding statement of principles for the sustainable management of forests. Among its provisions were that all countries, notably developed countries, should make an effort to green the world through reforestation and forest conservation. That states have a right to develop forests in keeping with national sustainable development policies. That specific financial resources should be provided to develop programs that encourage economic and social substitution policies. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, is the first multilateral legal instrument on climate change, adopted during the Earth Summit of 1992. As of 2015, the UNFCCC has 195 parties, including the following: all United Nations member states, UN General Assembly Observer State of Palestine, UN non-member states like Niue and Cook Islands, and a supranational union, that is European Union. The UNFCCC objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The framework sets non-binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions for individual countries and contains no enforcement mechanisms. Instead, the framework outlines how the specific international treaties may be negotiated to specify further action towards the objective of the UNFCCC. These international treaties are called protocols or agreements of UNFCCC. The parties to the convention have met annually from 1995 in Conference of the Parties (COP) to assess progress in dealing with climate change. All subsequent multilateral negotiations on different aspects of climate change, including both adaptation and mitigation, are being held based on the principles and objectives set out by the UNFCCC. Parties under UNFCCC. The UNFCCC divides countries into the following three main groups according to the differing commitments: Annex 1 parties, Annex 2 parties, and non-Annex parties. Annex 1 parties include the industrialized countries that were the members of the OECD, that is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in 1992. Also, the countries with the economies in transition, that is EIT parties, including the Baltic states, the Russian Federation, and several Central and Eastern European states, are also Annex 1 parties to the convention. Annex 2 parties consist of the OECD members of Annex 1 but not the EIT parties. They are required to provide financial resources to enable developing countries to undertake emissions reduction activities under the convention and to help them adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. Also, they have to take all practicable steps to promote the development and transfer of environmentally friendly technologies to EIT parties and developing countries. Funding provided by Annex 2 parties is channeled mostly through the conventional financial mechanism. Non-annex parties. Non-annex parties are mostly developing countries. Certain groups of developing countries are recognized by the convention as being especially vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change, including countries with low-lying coastal areas and those prone to desertification and drought. India is a non-annex party to the convention. Least developed countries. The 49 parties classified as least developed countries by the United Nations are given special consideration under the convention on account of their limited capacity to respond to climate change and adapt to its adverse effects. Parties are urged to take full account of the special situation of least developed countries when considering funding and technology transfer activities. Global Environment Facility. The Global Environment Facility was set up in 1991. During the early years, countries implemented activities with the support of three agencies: the World Bank, the United Nations Environment Program, the United Nations Development Program, that is UNDP, and United Nations Environment Program, that is UNEP. Since then, the partnership has evolved to include 183 countries and 18 agencies, as well as civil society organizations, that is CSO, indigenous peoples, and the private sector. The Global Environment Facility funds are available to developing countries and countries with economies in transition (EIT) to meet the objectives of the international environmental conventions and agreements. The Global Environment Facility provides funding for activities aimed at achieving global environmental benefits in the following areas: biological diversity, climate change, international waters, land degradation, primarily desertification and deforestation, ozone layer depletion, and persistent organic pollutants. At the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, the Global Environmental Facility became the funding mechanism for activities under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is UNFCCC, and the Convention on Biological Diversity, that is CBD. Since then, the Global Environmental Facility (GEF) has become the financial mechanism for the following conventions: UNFCCC, CBD, Stockholm Convention, UNCCD, and Minamata Convention. Kyoto Protocol of 1997. COP3 1997. The Kyoto Protocol is an international agreement linked to the UNFCCC which commits its parties by setting internationally binding emissions reduction targets. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in the Kyoto, Japan on 11 December 1997 and entered into force on 16 February 2005. Its first commitment period started in 2008 and ended in 2012. In Doha, Qatar, on 8 December 2012, the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol was adopted to resolve the issues for the second commitment period, that is 2013 to 2020. It recognized that developed countries are principally responsible for the current high levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So the protocol places a heavier burden on the developed nations under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Industrial and developed nations agreed to reduce their collective emissions of greenhouse gases by 5.2% from 1990 levels by the period 2008 to 2012. Crucially, the Kyoto Protocol committed even developed countries to make legally binding reductions in their greenhouse gas emissions. The targets for the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol cover emissions of the six main greenhouse gases, namely carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. The global cut in emissions of 5.2% was to be achieved by differential reductions for individual countries. Kyoto mechanism, that is carbon trading. Under the protocol, countries must meet the targets primarily through national measures. However, the protocol also offers them additional means to meet their targets by way of three market based mechanisms. The Kyoto mechanisms are international emissions trading, clean development mechanism CDM, and joint implementation JI. The mechanisms help to stimulate green investment and help parties meet their emission targets in a cost effective way. International emission trading, the part one of the Kyoto principles or Kyoto mechanisms. International emission trading, greenhouse gas emission was made a new commodity under the protocol mechanism. Parties with commitments under the Kyoto Protocol Annex B parties have accepted targets for limiting or reducing the emissions. These targets are expressed as levels of allowed emissions or assigned amounts at over 2008 to 2012 commitment period. The allowed emissions are divided into assigned amount units, that is AAUs. Emissions trading allows countries that have emission units to spare emissions permitted them but not use to sell this excess capacity to countries that are over their targets. Hence, more than actual emissions units can be traded and sold under the Kyoto Protocol's emissions trading scheme. Thus, a new commodity was created in the form of emission reductions or removals. Since carbon dioxide is the principal greenhouse gas, people speak simply of trading in carbon. Carbon is now tracked and traded like any other commodity. This is known as carbon markets. Emissions trading schemes may be established as climate policy instruments at the national level and the regional level. Under such schemes, governments set emissions obligations to be reached by the participating entities. The European Union Emissions Trading Scheme is the largest in the operation. Clean Development Mechanism. The Clean Development Mechanism, that is CDM, is the part two of the Kyoto mechanisms, allows a country with an emission reduction or emission limitation commitment under the Kyoto Protocol Annex B party to implement an emission reduction project in developing countries. Such projects can earn saleable certified emission reductions CER credits which can be counted towards meeting Kyoto targets. Each A certified emission reduction CER is considered equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. It is the first global environmental investment and credit scheme that provides a standardized emission offset instrument CERs. The mechanism stimulates sustainable development and emission reductions, while it gives industrialized countries some flexibility in how they meet their emission reduction or limitation targets. The CDM is the main source of income for the UNFCCC Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund is financed by a 2% levy on CERs issued by the CDM. Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund AF was established in 2001 to finance concrete adaptation projects and programs in developing country parties to the Kyoto Protocol, specifically the countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. The Adaptation Fund is financed with a share of proceeds from the Clean Development Mechanism CDM project activities and other sources of funding. The Adaptation Fund is supervised and managed by Fund Board. Joint implementation. The third part of the Kyoto mechanisms. The mechanism known as joint implementation allows a country with an emission reduction or limitation commitment under the Kyoto Protocol, that is Annex B party, to earn the emission reduction units, that is ERUs, from an emission reduction or emission removal project in another Annex B party, which can be counted towards meeting its Kyoto target. The joint implementation offers parties a flexible and cost efficient means of fulfilling a part of their Kyoto commitments, while the host party benefits from the foreign investment and technology transfer. Marrakesh Accord of 2001. The seventh conference of the party COP7 to the UNFCCC held in 2007 results in the Marrakesh Accords. The Marrakesh Accords details the rules and procedures for the meeting with the emission reduction targets set in the Kyoto Protocol (ERT). It set up the stage for ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. This had formalized an agreement on operational rules for international emissions trading, the Clean Development Mechanism CDM, and joint implementation along with the compliance regime and accounting procedures. CMP, Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties, CMP, to the Kyoto Protocol. The convention's supreme body is the Conference of Parties, which serves as the meeting of the parties, that is CMP, to the Kyoto Protocol. The sessions of the COP and the CMP are held during the same period to reduce cost and improve coordination between the convention and the protocol. Montreal Action Plan of COP11 or CMP1 of 2005. Following the entry into force of the Kyoto Protocol earlier in the year of 2005, the 11th Conference of Parties COP11 for the first time is held in conjunction with the first Conference of the Parties serving as meeting of the parties CMP1. CMP1 held in Montreal, Canada in November-December 2005 adopted the Marrakesh Accords as well as the draft CMP decisions that were negotiated after COP7. The UNFCCC in Montreal finalized the rule book of the Kyoto Protocol, the 1997 landmark treaty designed to curb greenhouse gas emissions for the first commitment period 2008 to 2012. Bali Roadmap or Bali Action Plan of 2007. COP13 or CMP3 2007. The 13th Conference of Parties adopted the Bali Roadmap, including the Bali Action Plan, charting course for a new negotiating process to address the climate change. The plan has the following five main categories: shared vision, mitigation, adaptation, technology, and financing. Other elements in the Bali roadmap include the following: a decision on deforestation and forest management, a decision on technology for developing countries, the establishment of the Adaptation Fund Board, the review of the financial mechanism going beyond the existing global environmental facility. Copenhagen Accord 2009, COP15 or CMP5 2009. World leaders gather for the 15th Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen, Denmark, which produced the Copenhagen Accord. The Copenhagen Accord expressed clearly a political intent to constrain carbon and restored to respond to climate change in both the short term and long term. Due to some serious disagreement between developing and developed countries, a legally binding agreement could not be finalized in COP15 Copenhagen. Finally, the Copenhagen Accord is a non-binding agreement. The Copenhagen Accord contained several key elements on which there was strong convergence of the views of governments. This included the long-term goal of limiting the maximum global average temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels subject to a review in 2015. There was, however, no agreement on how to do this in practical terms. It also included a reference to consider limiting the temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees, a key demand made by vulnerable developing countries. The accord stated that the developed nation, that is Annex 1, had agreed to set targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. Developing nations agreed to pursue nationally appropriate reduction strategy to slow the growth of their emission but refused to commit on reduction of their carbon output. Developed countries promised to fund for the following: take actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the inevitable effects of climate change in developing countries. Developed countries promised the following: to provide US $30 billion for the period of 2010-2012 and to mobilize the long-term finance of further US$100 billion a year by 2020 from a variety of sources. The establishment of the following four new bodies was announced: a mechanism on RED Plus, a high-level panel under the COP to study the implementation of financial provisions, the Copenhagen Green Climate Fund, and a technology mechanism. Cancun Agreement of 2010. COP16 or CMP 6 of 2010, it looked forward to preparing a second commitment period for the Kyoto Protocol. As per the agreements they concluded in Cancun, all parties to the convention, including the developed and the developing countries, have agreed to report their voluntary mitigation goals for implementation. Parties agreed at Cancun for the following: to commit a maximum temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to consider lowering the maximum to 1.5 degrees in the near future. To make fully operational by 2012 a technology mechanism to boost the innovation, development, and spread of new climate friendly technologies. To establish a green climate fund to provide financing to projects, programs, policies, and other activities in developing countries via thematic funding windows. On the Cancun Adaptation Framework, which included setting up an adaptation committee to promote the implementation of stronger cohesive action on adaptation. Green Climate Fund (GCF). Green Climate Fund is a UN-backed fund considered as the key vehicle for the funding the climate-related development programs. It is guided by the provisions and the principles of the UNFCCC. The general concept for the Green Climate Fund is first proposed at COP15 to UNFCCC in Copenhagen, Denmark in 2009. The COP16 in Cancun, Mexico in 2010 decides to establish GCF, that is Green Climate Fund. The fund establishes its permanent headquarters in Songdo, Republic of Korea in 2013. The fund aims to allocate its resources to low emission and climate resilient projects and programs in developing countries. The fund pays particular attention to the needs of societies that are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, in particular, least developed countries, small island developing states, and the African states. The Green Climate Fund launched its initial resource mobilization in 2014 and rapidly gathered pledges worth around $10 billion. These funds come mainly from developed countries, but also from some developing countries, regions, and one city, Paris. The fund's investments can be in the form of grants, loans, equity, or guarantees. Board of 24 members governs this body and was initially supported by a secretariat. GSF was central to the Paris Climate Agreement signed in year 2015. It was intended to be the linchpin among the efforts to raise climate finance of $100 billion a year by 2020. Doha Amendments of 2012. COP 18 or CMP 18 2012. At the 18th Conference of Parties, governments agreed to speedily work towards a universal climate change agreement by 2015 and to find ways to scale up efforts before 2020 beyond existing pledges to curb emissions. They also adopted the Doha Amendment, launching a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol period was extended as it propagated a second commitment period from 2013 to 2020. Russia, Japan, and Canada refused to join the second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol. The amendments to the Kyoto Protocol include the following: new commitments for the Annex 1 parties, a revised list of greenhouse gases, amendments to several articles of the Kyoto Protocol, which specifically reference issues pertaining to the first commitment period and which needed to be updated for the second commitment period. Warsaw Summit 2013 or COP19 or CMP8. The G77 and China led the group of 132 poor countries which staged a walkout during talks about loss and damage compensation for the consequences of global warming. Poor countries have demanded that the developed nations to give them $100 billion annually by 2020. Paris Agreement of 2015. COP21 or CMP11 2015. The Paris Agreement for the first time brings all nations into a common cause based on their historic, current, and future responsibilities. It deals with the greenhouse gases emissions mitigation, adaptation, and finance starting in the year 2020. It was opened for signature on the Earth Day 22 April in 2016 and till date 185 parties have ratified it. It entered into force on November 4, 2016, 30 days after the so-called double threshold has been met. This agreement, in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, including by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels, increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production, and making the finance flows consistent with a pathway towards the low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. This agreement aims to be implemented to reflect equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of differential national circumstances. The Paris Agreement addresses crucial areas necessary to combat the climate change. Some of the key aspects of the agreement are set out below: long term temperature goal, global peaking and climate neutrality, mitigation and adaptation, sinks and reservoirs, voluntary cooperation or market and non market based approaches, loss and damage, finance, technology and capacity building support, climate change education, training, public awareness, public participation and public access to information, transparency, implementation and compliance, global stock take, GST. Nationally determined contributions. NDCs are at the heart of the Paris Agreement and the achievement of these long term goals. NDCs embody efforts by each country to reduce the national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. The Paris Agreement requires each country to outline and communicate their post 2020 climate actions known as the NDCs. The contribution that each individual country should make in order to achieve the worldwide goal are determined by all countries individually, called Intended Nationally Determined Contributions (INDCs). This includes requirements that all parties report regularly on their emissions and on their implementation efforts. So NDCs are submitted every 5 years to the UNFCCC Secretariat, with the next round of NDCs new or updated being submitted by 2020. These targets will not be binding as it is not possible to enforce them. NDCs will be revised after 5 years in 2023. There will also be a global stocktake every 5 years to assess the collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the agreement and to inform further individual actions by parties. India's INDCs. India is a signatory to the Paris Agreement. India proposed INDC targets reduce the emission intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 level, achieve about 40% of electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel by 2030, create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030. Besides, India has also decided to anchor a global solar alliance, INSPA, International Agency for Solar Policy and Application of all countries located in between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. The INDC proposals are based on the following areas: sustainable lifestyles, cleaner economic development, reduce emission intensity of gross domestic product, increase the share of non-fossil fuel based electricity, enhancing carbon sink forests, adaptation, mobilizing finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. Despite facing enormous development challenges like poverty eradication, ensuring housing, electricity, and food security for all, India declared a voluntary goal of reducing the emissions intensity of its GDP by 20 to 25% over 2005 levels by 2020. To accelerate development and deployment of renewable energy in the country, the government is taking a number of initiatives like upscaling of targets for renewable energy capacity addition from 30 gigawatts by 2016-17 to 175 gigawatts by 2021-2022. India already has the ambitious climate action plans in place, National Climate Action Plan. The National Climate Action Plan has the 8 sub-plans for the specific areas such as solar energy, water, Himalayan ecosystem, etc. The technology gap between rich and the poor countries remains enormous, and the capacity of developing economies to adopt new technology needs to be enhanced. Enhanced action on technology development and the transfer will be central in enabling the full and effective implementation of India's INDC. Lastly, the approach of India's INDC has been anchored in the vision of equity inspired by the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi's famous exhortation. Earth has enough resources to meet people's needs, but will never have enough to satisfy people's greed. In the INDC, the country has focused on adaptation efforts, including developing sustainable habitats, optimizing water use efficiency, creating ecologically sustainable climate resilient agricultural production systems, safeguarding the Himalayan glaciers and mountain ecosystem, and enhancing the carbon sinks in sustainably managed forests, and implementing adaptation measures for vulnerable species, forest dependent communities, and ecosystems. Global stock take. The GST to take place in 2023 and every 5 years thereafter was formed under the Paris Agreement in 2015. A global stock take will assess collective progress toward achieving the purpose of the agreement in a comprehensive and facilitative manner. It will be based on the best available science and its long-term global goal. Its outcome will inform parties in updating and enhancing their actions and support and enhancing international cooperation on climate action. Climate Neutral Now. Climate Neutral Now is an initiative launched by the UN Climate Change in 2015. It aimed at encouraging and supporting all levels of society to take climate action to achieve a climate neutral world by mid century, as enshrined in the Paris Agreement adopted the same year. Because to achieve the Paris Agreement objective, relying solely on governmental action will not be sufficient. The initiative therefore invites companies, organizations, governments, and citizens to work towards climate neutrality by reducing their climate footprint to a simple three-step method, such as measure their greenhouse gas emissions, reduce them as much as possible, and compensate those which cannot be avoided by using UN certified emission reductions CER. CMA. COP serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement is regarded as CMA. All states that are parties to the Paris Agreement are represented at the CMA, while states that are not parties participate as observers. The CMA oversees the implementation of the Paris Agreement and takes decisions to promote its effective implementation. CMA met for the first time in conjunction with COP22 in Marrakesh in November 2016. It is also known as CMA 1. Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD). Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD) was signed at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992. It entered into force on 29 December 1993. It is the first global agreement to cover all aspects of biological diversity. The Secretariat of the Convention of Biological Diversity (SCBD), based in Montreal, Canada, was established to support the goals of convention. The CBD is an international legally binding treaty. The Convention on Biological Diversity was inspired by the world community's growing commitment to sustainable development. Its overall objective is to encourage actions which lead the world towards a sustainable future. It has the following three main objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. The Convention on Biological Diversity covers biodiversity at all levels: ecosystems, species, and genetic resources. It also covers biotechnological aspects, including through the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. In fact, it covers all possible domains that are directly or indirectly related to biodiversity and its role in development, ranging from politics, science, and education to agriculture, culture, business, and much more. The CBD's governing body is the Conference of the Parties. This ultimate authority of all governments or parties that have ratified the treaty meets every 2 years to review progress, set priorities, and commit to work plans. The Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity (SCBD) is based in Montreal, Canada. The convention has near universal membership with 196 parties. USA is the only major country which is not a party to the CBD. Global Biodiversity Outlook. Global Biodiversity Outlook is the flagship publication of Convention on Biological Diversity. It is a periodic report that summarizes the latest data on status and trends of biodiversity. It also draws conclusions relevant to the further implementation of the convention. Cartagena Protocol 2000. The Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety to the Convention on Biological Diversity is an international treaty governing the movements of living modified organisms (LMOs). It was adopted in 2000 as a supplementary agreement to the Convention on Biological Diversity and entered into force in 2003. India is the party of this protocol since 2003. The protocol seeks to protect the biological diversity from the potential risks posed by living modified organisms (LMOs) resulting from modern biotechnology. It establishes an Advanced Informed Agreement (AIA) procedure. The protocol also establishes a biosafety clearinghouse to facilitate the exchange of information on living modified organisms and to assist countries in the implementation of the protocol. CBD COP10 Nagoya Protocol 2010. The Nagoya Protocol on Access to Genetic Resources Benefit Sharing (ABS) was adopted in 2010 in Nagoya, Japan. It entered into force in 2014 and India is the party since then. The Nagoya Protocol onto the Convention on Biological Diversity is a supplementary agreement to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Its objective is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources, thereby contributing to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. It applies to genetic resources that are covered by the CBD and to the benefits arising from their utilization. The Nagoya Protocol also covers traditional knowledge (TK) associated with the genetic resources that are covered by the CBD and the benefits arising from its utilization. It also addresses genetic resources where indigenous and local communities have the established right to grant access to them. Contracting parties are to take measures to ensure these communities' prior informed consent and fair and equitable benefit sharing, keeping in mind community laws and procedures as well as customary use and exchange. The Convention on Biological Diversity recognizes the sovereign rights of states over their natural resources in areas within their jurisdiction. Parties to the convention therefore have the authority to determine access to genetic resources in areas within their jurisdiction. Parties also have the obligation to take appropriate measures with the aim of sharing the benefits derived from their use. Parties have agreed to develop national and regional parties targets and reports thereon to the Conference of the Parties at its 11th meeting COP11 in 2012 in Hyderabad. Parties have committed to revising and or updating their national biodiversity strategies and plans SAPs in light of the new strategic plan and to implement them as policy instruments by COP12. Why is the Nagoya Protocol important? The Nagoya Protocol will create greater legal certainty and transparency for both providers and users of genetic resources by establishing more predictable conditions for access to genetic resources, helping to ensure benefit sharing when genetic resources leave the country providing the genetic resources. By helping to ensure benefit sharing, the Nagoya Protocol creates incentives to conserve and sustainably use genetic resources and therefore enhances the contribution of biodiversity to development and a human well-being. Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020. In 2010, parties to the CBD adopted the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020, a 10-year framework for action by all countries and stakeholders to safeguard biodiversity and the benefits it provides to people. As part of the strategic plan, 20 ambitious but realistic targets, known as Aichi biodiversity targets, were adopted. The strategic plan for biodiversity is comprised the vision living in harmony with nature, where by 2050 biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering the benefits essential for all people. The new plan consists of the five strategic goals. Strategic Goal A addresses the underlying causes. Strategic Goal B reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity. Strategic Goal C to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. Strategic Goal D enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. Strategic Goal E enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. IG biodiversity targets. The IG biodiversity targets or IG targets were adopted by the Convention on the Biological Diversity CBD at Nagoya Conference in 2010. Living in harmony with nature, the United Nations Decade on Biodiversity contributes to the implementation of a strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2020. The 20 headline Aichi biodiversity targets are organized under the five strategic goals. The important Aichi targets are the following. By 2020, at the latest, people are aware of the values of biodiversity. By 2020, at least, biodiversity values have been integrated into national and local development. By 2020, at the latest, governments, business, and stakeholders at all levels have taken steps to achieve or have implemented plans for sustainable production and consumption. By 2020, the rate of loss of all natural habitats, including forests, is at least halved. By 2020, areas under agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry are managed sustainably, ensuring the conservation of biodiversity. By 2020, pollution, including from excess nutrients, has been brought to levels that are not detrimental to ecosystem function and biodiversity. By 2020, invasive alien species and the pathways are identified and prioritized. Priority species are controlled or eradicated. By 2020, the extinction of known threatened species has been prevented, and their conservation status, particularly of those most in decline, has been improved and sustained. By 2020, knowledge, the science base, and technologies relating to biodiversity are improved, widely shared, and transferred and applied. CBD COP11 Hyderabad. India has hosted the 11th Conference of Parties COP11 to the CBD In Hyderabad on 1st to 19th October 2012, developed countries agreed to double funding to support efforts in developing states. Main goals of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 and 2020. The COP also set targets to increase the number of countries that have included biodiversity in their national development plans. About $30 billion in the next 8 years of additional financial flows to developing countries. The 193 parties to the CBD agreed to classify a diverse list of marine areas, some renowned for containing hidden treasures of the plant and animal world as ecologically or biologically significant. To meet the IG biodiversity target of ensuring that 10% of marine areas are protected by 2020, the conference also saw the launch of Hyderabad Call for Biodiversity Champions. India has committed $50 million called the Hyderabad Pledge. These funds will be used to enhance technical and human capabilities at the national and state level mechanisms to attain the CBD objectives. India has instituted together with UNDP Biodiversity Governance Awards, and the first such awards were given during the COP11. India proposed to institute Rajiv Gandhi International Award for harnessing biodiversity for livelihoods. UN Conference on Sustainable Development, UNCSD, Rio Plus 20, 2012. Rio Plus 20 is the name for the UNCSD, which took place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in June 2012, 20 years after the landmark 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. In this conference, the official discussions focused on following two main themes. One, green economy. Two, how to improvise international coordination for sustainable development. In Rio, member states decided to launch a process to develop a set of sustainable development goals and to establish the UN high-level political forum on sustainable development. It had been built upon the Millennium Development Goals and converged with post-2015 development agenda. The conference also adopted groundbreaking guidelines on green economy policies. The conference also took forward-looking decisions on a number of thematic areas, including energy, food security, ocean cities, etc. The Rio Plus 20 outcome also contained for future programs of work in small island developing states and more. Millennium Development Goals versus Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were launched in 2000 for the period of 2000 to 2015. The Millennium Development Goals focus primarily on the social agenda, while the Sustainable Development Goals are broad in scope because they will address the interconnected elements of sustainable development, that is, economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. The Millennium Development Goals targeted developing countries, particularly the poorest, while the Sustainable Development Goals will apply to the entire world, the rich and the poor. UN Sustainable Development Summit 2015. The United Nations Summit for the Adoption of the Post 2015 Development Agenda was held from 25 to 27 December, September 2015 in New York and convened as a high level plenary meeting of the General Assembly. In this summit, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, summarizing 169 targets, were announced to demonstrate the scale and ambition of this new Universal 2030 agenda. They were considered as an urgent call for action by all countries, developed and developing in a global partnership. They seek to realize the human rights of all and to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 1, end poverty in all its forms and everywhere. Goal 2, end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Goal 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Goal 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Goal 6, ensure the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Goal 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Promote sustain. Goal 8, promote sustain inclusive and sustainable economic growth full and productive employment and decent work for all. Goal 9. Build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Goal 10. Reduce inequality within and among countries. Goal 11. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Goal 12. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Goal 13. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Goal 14. Conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Goal 15. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. Goal 16. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Goal 17. Strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable developments. Now, the annual high level political forum on sustainable development serves as the central UN platform for the follow up of and review of the sustainable developmental goals. You can see here different SDGs and their motto and their symbols. Important 5 P's of the SDGs. The goals and targets will stimulate action over the next 15 years in areas of critical importance for humanity and the planet, such as people, to end poverty and hunger, and to fulfill their potential in dignity and equality and in a healthy environment. Planet, to protect the planet from degradation, sustainably managing its natural resources, and support the needs of the present and future generations. Prosperity, peace, and partnership. The year of 2015. 2015 was a landmark year for multilateralism international policy, shaping with the adoption of several major agreements. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, March 2015. Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, July 2015. Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, was adopted at the UN Sustainable Development Summit in New York. Paris Agreement on Climate Change, UNREDD program, RED program, reducing the emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. The United Nations Collaborative Program on reducing the emissions from the deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries was launched in 2008. It builds on the convening role and technical expertise of the following organizations: Food and Agricultural Organizations of the United Nations, United Nations Developing Program, and United Nations Environment Program. Role of the United Nations RED. The UN RED program supports nationally led RED Plus processes. It also promotes the informed and meaningful involvement of all stakeholders, including indigenous peoples and other forest dependent communities, in national and international RED Plus implementation. RED Plus. RED Plus is a mechanism developed by parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC). It creates a financial value for the carbon stored in forests. Developing countries would receive results-based payments for results-based actions. RED Plus is seen as one of the most cost-effective ways of stabilizing the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gas emissions to avoid a temperature rise of 4 degrees Celsius. RED Plus goes beyond simply deforestation and forest degradation and includes the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. Since RED Plus is part of the climate change solution, but RED Plus alone cannot adequately mitigate or abate climate change. The implementation of RED Plus must coexist with significant emission reductions in both developed and developing countries if we hope to curb the climate change. RED Plus readiness. RED Plus readiness relates to the efforts a country is undertaking with the support of multilateral or bilateral support to build its capacity to be ready for a RED Plus mechanism. RED Plus conceptualizes flow of positive incentives for demonstrated reduction in deforestation or for enhancing quality and expose of forest cover. India has made a submission to UNFCCC on RED Sustainable Management of Forests (SMF) and Afforestation and Reforestation (ANR) in December 2008. Other international conventions and protocols for natural resources. The Convention on Wetlands, called as Ramsar Convention. Ramsar Convention 1971. The Convention on Wetlands, called the Ramsar Convention, is an intergovernmental treaty. First modern treaty between countries aimed at conserving natural resources. Framework for the conservation and wise use of wetlands was adopted in the Iranian city of Ramsar in 1971 and came into force in 1975. Since then, almost 90% of the UN members from all works geographic regions have acceded to become contracting parties. The convention aims to the conservation and wise use of all wetlands through local and national actions and international cooperation, contributing towards achieving sustainable development. Headquarters of the International and Union for the Conservation of Nature (IUCN) in Gland, Switzerland. The convention uses a broad definition of wetlands under three pillars of the convention: work towards the wise use of all their wetlands, designate suitable wetlands for the list, cooperate internationally on transboundary wetlands. Wetlands of international importance, the Ramsar sites. They are recognized as being of significant value not only for the country or the countries in which they are located, but for humanity as a whole. Suitable wetlands for designation by referring to the criteria. The inclusion of a wetland in the list embodies the government's commitments. The convention includes various measures to respond to threats to the ecological character of sites, aimed at conserving the wetland and ensuring its wise use. Wise use under Ramsar Convention can be broadly defined as maintaining the ecological character of a wetland. Wetlands can be included on the list of wetlands of international importance because of their ecological, zoological, botanical, limnological, and hydrological importance. List of Ramsar sites in India. The convention entered into force in India on 1st February 1982. India currently has 27. As of now, it has 75 sites designated as Ramsar sites with a surface area more than 10 lakh hectares. We will cover different Ramsar sites in a completely another video. The Montreal Record. It was adopted by the Conference of the Contracting Parties to the Ramsar Convention in Brisbane, 1996, accompanying the guidelines for operation of the Montreal Record. The Montreal Record is a register of wetland sites on the list of wetlands of international. It is the principal tool of convention and is maintained as part of the Ramsar list. It is a voluntary mechanism to highlight specific wetlands of international importance that are facing immediate challenges. The wetland of international importance is considered where changes in ecological character have occurred or occurring or are likely to occur. Currently, there are only two Indian wetlands listed in the Montreal record, such as Kulado National Park, Rajasthan, and Loktak Lake or Manipur. Chilika Lake, Odisha was included in the Montreal record in 1993, but have been removed in November 2002. Chilika Lake gets Wetland Conservation Award for 2002. United Nations Convention to Combat the Desertification, UNCCD, in 1994, legally binding environment and development to sustainable land management. The convention addresses specifically the arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid areas known as drylands. UNCCD Secretariat is in Bonn, Germany. The UNCCD Secretariat facilitates cooperation between developed and developing countries, particularly around knowledge and technology transfer for sustainable land management. The new UNCCD 2018 to 2030 strategic framework is the most comprehensive global commitment to achieve land degradation neutrality, to improve the livelihoods, to reduce the impacts of droughts. All these commitments are required to achieve a land degradation neutral world consistent with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The UNCCD is particularly committed to a bottom-up approach, encouraging the participation of local people in combating desertification and land degradation. As the dynamics of land, climate, and biodiversity are intimately connected, the UNCCD collaborates closely with other two Rio conventions to meet these complex challenges with an integrated approach and the best possible use of natural resources. Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD) and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC). United Nations Decade for Desert and Fight Against Desertification, 2010 to 2020. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC 1988.